What do you say at the funeral of someone who never showed you love? When Michael's grandmother passed away in California, the family sat in silence. Too many scars, too much pain. But when he stood up to speak, something happened that none of them expected. What began as a painful goodbye turned into a discovery that would change the way they remembered her forever. Welcome to Folktales Hub. Please, while you are here, hit the subscribe button and share with friends. I want to tell you a story about something that happened in my family, right here in California. It's a story about pain, about secrets, about an ending none of us expected. But more than that, it's a story about compassion, about how sometimes the people who are hardest to love are the ones who need love the most. It all began at a funeral. My grandmother, Margaret Turner, had passed away at the age of 85. She was wealthy, respected in her community, and from the outside you might think her family adored her. But if you had been sitting with us that morning at Westfield Funeral Home in Los Angeles, you would have seen the truth. None of us wanted to be there. None of us wanted to pretend we were sad. You see, my grandmother was not an easy woman. She was sharp-tongued, demanding, and if I'm being honest, often cruel. For as long as I could remember, she had used her money and her words like weapons. She cut people down when they didn't meet her standards, and she made sure everyone around her knew who was in charge. I'm 29 years old, a high school English teacher. My name is David. In my family, I was always the quiet one, the grandson who stayed on the edges. My cousins fought for Grandma Margaret's approval like it was gold, because in a way it was. Everyone knew she was wealthy, and everyone wanted to stay in her good graces. But I learned early on that the closer you got to her, the more she could hurt you. My cousin Mark, who had struggled with his weight as a teenager, still twitched when anyone made a joke about food because of the things she used to say. My cousin Lily, who once dreamed of becoming a painter, gave up that dream after Grandma spent an entire Christmas dinner explaining how artists starve, and no serious woman wastes her time with paintbrushes. That was how she was. Her words weren't random, they were precise, cutting exactly where it hurt the most. And yet, despite all of that, people kept circling her, kept competing for her affection, because she dangled the promise of inheritance in front of us like a prize. Whoever pleased her the most, whoever made her feel important, would surely be rewarded when she was gone. That was the game everyone played. Everyone except me. I'd stopped playing years ago. I didn't want to fight for her attention. Instead, I visited her occasionally, once every few months maybe. I'd sit in her grand living room, surrounded by velvet drapes and heavy furniture, and listen as she complained about the family, the neighbors, or the world in general. I didn't argue with her, but I also didn't agree with everything she said. Sometimes I even pushed back gently. She once told me, "You're the only one who doesn't want anything from me." I never knew if she meant that as praise or as an accusation. Either way, it was true. And now, here we all were, sitting stiffly in the funeral home, watching as her closed casket sat at the front of the room surrounded by flowers that no one had really sent with love. The funeral director, a nervous man named Mr. Peterson, was trying his best to keep things dignified, but I could see the panic growing in his eyes. "Would anyone like to come forward and share some words about Mrs. Turner?" he asked, his voice polite but pleading. Silence. My Uncle Richard looked down at his shoes, fiddling with the edge of his tie. My Aunt Carol scrolled through her phone like she was waiting for a message more important than the funeral itself. My cousins avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the floral arrangements or the pattern on the carpet. "Surely someone has a memory to share," Mr. Peterson tried again, his smile a little tighter this time. "A story. A lesson she taught you." Still silence. I felt embarrassed, not just for my family but for the whole scene. There were neighbors there, church friends, people who expected to hear about the wonderful life of Margaret Turner. And here we were, too bitter or too wounded to say a word. Finally, my uncle cleared his throat. "She was a strong woman," he said, his voice thin. "Strong-willed," my aunt corrected quickly, though even that sounded like she was being generous. Mr. Peterson's eyes darted around, his desperation obvious now. I'm sure in all his years of conducting funerals, He had never seen a family so unwilling to speak kindly about the deceased. And then, before I even realized what I was doing, I stood up. "I'll do it," I said. Every head in the room turned toward me. My uncle raised his eyebrows in surprise. My cousin Mark looked worried, like I'd lost my mind. My aunt whispered, "David, you don't have to." "It's fine," I told her, walking toward the podium. "Someone should say something." As I stood at the lectern, looking out at the crowd, my heart pounded in my chest. The truth was, I didn't know what to say. I couldn't stand there and tell everyone how cruel she had been, how she had left scars on each of us. But I also couldn't just stand there in silence. So I did the only thing that came to mind. "Delight. My grandmother, Margaret Turner," I began, "was a woman who taught me that love comes in many forms." I could see my cousin Lily's eyes widen. "Love. From Grandma." But I kept going. "When I was young, she would invite me into her kitchen on Sunday afternoons," I said. "She taught me how to bake her famous apple pie, the one with the secret ingredient she never wrote down." None of that was true. Margaret Turner never baked anything in her life, unless you count dialing the caterer. But the people in the crowd leaned in. They wanted this story. They wanted this version of her. "She told me stories about her childhood," I continued, inventing more as I went along. "She said that even when times were hard, her family always found ways to help neighbors who had even less." Also false. She had grown up in wealth and privilege. But as I spoke, I saw the faces in the crowd soften. Some even wiped away tears. "She taught me that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room," I said, glancing at my Uncle Richard, who had spent his whole life trying to argue with his mother. "It's about being the person others can count on when everything falls apart." That line, made up on the spot, seemed to hit people the hardest. Saw nods. I saw my aunt's eyes fill with tears. I told story after story, none of them true. How she encouraged me to follow my dreams. How she told me kindness was more valuable than money. How she believed in people even when they didn't believe in themselves. Each sentence felt like a lie but also like a gift. I was giving her something in death she had never earned in life. Dignity. Finally, I ended with this. "She taught me that sometimes the people who are hardest to love are the ones who need it the most." I stepped back. The room erupted in applause. Shrill applause. My family clapped. The neighbors clapped. Even Mr. Peterson, the funeral director, clapped with relief. I walked back to my seat feeling strangely empty and full at the same time. Had lied, yes. But I had also given everyone in that room a story they could hold on to, a memory that never really existed but felt better than the truth. The rest of the service went by in a blur. Hymns were sung, prayers were spoken, the casket was carried out. At the graveside, as Margaret Turner was lowered into the ground, I felt a strange mix of guilt and peace. For the first time I had chosen kindness over honesty, and I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, because as people began to leave the cemetery, a man in an expensive suit walked straight toward me. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and a confident smile. "Mr. Turner," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Charles Bennett, your grandmother's attorney." I shook his hand politely. "Nice to meet you." "That was a beautiful eulogy," he said, his smile sharp, almost knowing. "Very creative." I flushed with embarrassment. "Thank you. I just thought someone had to say something nice." "Yes," he said, his smile widening. "And you did. Congratulations, David. You just passed her final test." The sun had started to sink lower in the California sky, casting a soft orange glow through the stained glass windows of the little church. It was one of those churches that didn't look like much from the outside, just plain white walls and a modest bell tower, but inside it carried the weight of every whispered prayer, every tear dropped quietly into folded hands, and every memory of families who had come there searching for peace. Michael sat on one of the front pews, staring at his hands, which were clasped so tightly together that his knuckles looked pale. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there. The room felt endless, though he knew it was small. His chest carried the heaviness of silence. A silence broken only by the creak of the wooden floor when someone shifted their weight or the occasional cough that echoed too loudly against the high ceiling. Emily sat just a few rows behind him. She hadn't said much since they'd left the cemetery. Her face was calm, but Michael knew that behind her quietness lived a storm of emotions. Emily had been there through the worst of it. She'd witnessed the sharp words their grandmother, Margaret, had thrown over the years. She'd seen the way the family fractured under that weight. And yet, somehow, Emily always carried herself with a strange kind of grace, as though she refused to let the ugliness of the past settle on her. People had gathered in the church after the burial. It wasn't a large crowd. Only those who couldn't bring themselves to completely sever ties had shown up. Aunts, uncles, a handful of cousins, and a few neighbors who remembered Margaret from her younger days. But even in this small gathering there was tension. It felt like everyone had shown up because they were supposed to, not because they wanted to. The pastor, a gentleman named Reverend Thomas, had tried to lead the service with kind words. But he stumbled when it came to Margaret's eulogy. He spoke of her strength, her resilience, her ability to keep her family together through hard times, but his voice shook as he said it, almost as though he knew his words were not the full truth. Michael couldn't blame him. How do you stand at the front of a room, speaking of a woman everyone feared, and pretend she was someone she wasn't? When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share memories, no one moved. Not one person stood up. The silence stretched long, painful, suffocating. Michael's chest tightened as he watched the pastor's eyes scan the room, desperate for someone to fill the emptiness. He saw his mother lower her gaze to the floor. His uncle shifted uncomfortably, tapping his foot. His cousin pretended to fumble with a tissue. Michael felt anger rise in him, though he didn't know who it was directed at. Was he angry at his grandmother, for leaving behind such bitterness that no one wanted to remember her? Or was he angry at the family, for sitting in silence, letting the truth win out in such a cruel way? And then he did something he never thought he would do. He stood up. The wooden pew groaned as he rose, and all eyes turned toward him. His legs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone, but he forced himself to walk toward the front. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't prepare anything. But something inside him refused to let his grandmother's story end in silence. When he reached the front, he placed his hand on the edge of the pulpit. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. For a moment he couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat, and he wanted to run back to his seat. But then he saw Emily. She was watching him with steady eyes, her expression soft, encouraging. And somehow that gave him the strength to open his mouth. "My name is Michael," he began, his voice unsteady. "I'm Margaret's grandson." There was a rustle in the room, a shifting of bodies. Everyone knew who he was, of course, but it felt important to say it out loud. "I know," he swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I know my grandmother wasn't easy. I know she wasn't gentle with her words. She had sharp edges. And sometimes those edges cut deep." He heard a few murmurs ripple through the pews. He could almost feel his mother stiffen behind him, as though she wanted to stop him before he said too much. "But," he continued, "I also know she lived a life full of struggle. She didn't grow up with much kindness. She didn't have the luxury of softness. And maybe that made her into someone who didn't always know how to love in a way we wanted. But I think, deep down in her own way, she tried." His words felt strange, even to himself. Did he really believe them? Or was he saying them because no one else would? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the silence had been unbearable, and he had to fill it with something. "I remember one time," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "When I was a kid, I came home from school after someone had made fun of me. I was crying and I didn't want anyone to see. But my grandmother, she found me. She didn't hug me, she didn't tell me it was going to be okay. That wasn't who she was. But she sat down next to me and told me, 'Don't ever let them see you break.'" He paused, glancing at the faces in front of him. At the time I thought it was harsh. But looking back now, I think that was her way of telling me to be strong. It was her way of giving me the only comfort she knew how to give. The room was quiet. Some people looked down, others looked at him with surprise. Michael knew he wasn't painting Margaret as a saint, but he also wasn't condemning her. He was trying to find some small thread of humanity in a woman everyone had written off. "I don't know if that makes her good or bad," he admitted, his voice softer now. "All I know is she was human. And maybe that's what we need to remember, that even in her flaws she was still one of us." When he stepped back from the pulpit, his legs trembled. He returned to his seat, his heart racing, unsure of how his words had been received. Emily reached for his hand. She didn't say anything, but the gentle squeeze of her fingers was enough. The pastor cleared his throat, his face pale but grateful. He quickly moved the service along, but the air in the room had changed. The silence had been broken. Michael's words lingered, like a fragile thread holding the moment together. After the service ended, people slowly made their way outside. The late afternoon air was cooler now, and the sky had turned shades of pink and gold. Groups formed on the church steps, speaking in hushed voices. Some people avoided Michael's eyes, while others gave him small nods of acknowledgement. He didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't sure if he had done the right thing or if he had just opened an old wound. But when his mother approached him, her face unreadable, his heart nearly stopped. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered sharply. "People will think you're defending her." Michael swallowed hard. "I wasn't defending her. I was just trying to say something. Anything." His mother's eyes glistened, and for a moment Michael thought she might cry. But she turned away before any tears could fall. That night, when Michael lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed every word he had spoken. He wondered if his grandmother, wherever she was, had heard him. And for the first time in years, he found himself thinking not about the woman who had hurt them all, but about the girl she must have once been, the girl who had learned to hide her pain so deeply that no one could ever reach it. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that thought stayed with him long after the night had turned to morning. The days after the funeral passed slowly, like the hours themselves were reluctant to move. The California sun kept shining, life outside went on with its noise and busyness, but inside Michael carried a silence that felt heavier than anything he had spoken at the church. He tried to go back to his routine, work, errands, phone calls, small talk, but Margaret's presence clung to him, even in her absence. The memory of her sharp words, the coldness of her stare, the sting of her criticism, all of it hovered in his chest. Yet strangely, what echoed louder than all of that was the sound of his own voice at the pulpit, speaking words he hadn't even known he carried until they spilled out. Emily noticed. She always noticed. "You haven't been sleeping," she said one night as they sat on the porch. The warm evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, but even that sweetness couldn't ease the weight on his face. "I keep thinking," Michael admitted, his voice quiet, "about what I said. About her. About whether it was true, or if I just made it up to make the silence less awful." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "Does it matter if it was perfectly true?" she asked softly. "Or does it matter more that you tried to see her as a whole person?" Michael let out a long breath. "But what if she didn't deserve it? What if I gave her more kindness in death than she ever gave in life?" For a while they just sat there, the night settling in around them. Emily didn't rush to fill the silence. She never did. Finally she said, "Sometimes grace isn't about who deserves it. Sometimes it's about setting yourself free." Those words sank into him like seeds, though he didn't yet know what they would grow into. A week later Michael's mother called. Her voice was strained, the way it always was when she talked about Margaret. "I found some of her things," she said. "I don't want them in my house. Do you want to come look before I throw them out?" Michael hesitated. The thought of sifting through Margaret's belongings made his stomach twist. But something inside him pushed him to say yes. When he arrived at his mother's house, He found a few cardboard boxes stacked in the living room. They weren't many. Margaret had never been one for sentimental clutter. But inside were pieces of her life. Old photographs, letters yellowed with age, a cracked porcelain teacup, a faded Bible with underlined passages. Michael sat on the floor and began sorting through them. Most of it felt impersonal, like artifacts of a stranger's life. But then he found a small notebook, its cover worn and corners bent. When he opened it, his breath caught. It wasn't filled with sermons or grocery lists or angry rants, as he half expected. It was filled with her handwriting, uneven but steady. And inside were pages upon pages of unsent letters. The first one began simply, "To my son." Michael's heart pounded as he read. The words were clumsy, sometimes harsh, but beneath them lived something unexpected: regret. Margaret had written about her own failures, her inability to express love, the way life had hardened her. "I never knew how to be soft," one letter said. "My mother beat the softness out of me. By the time I raised you, all I had left were walls. I thought strength meant never bending. I didn't know it also meant breaking." Michael's throat tightened. Page after page revealed a woman who had been trapped inside her own history, unable to find her way out. She had wanted to love, but she didn't know how. And then he found one written to him. "To my grandson Michael. I know you think I never cared for you. I know my words were sharp and they cut. But I saw myself in you. I saw your strength and I wanted to protect it. I didn't know how to tell you that you were more than enough. I am sorry I never said the words you needed to hear. If there's anything left of me when I'm gone, I hope it is this. I did love you, even if I couldn't show it." Michael pressed the notebook to his chest, tears slipping down his cheeks. For years he had carried anger, confusion, emptiness. And now, in his hands, he held the proof of something he had longed for but never believed possible. She had loved him. Imperfectly, silently, but deeply in her own broken way. When he showed the notebook to Emily later that night, she held him close. "This doesn't erase the pain," she whispered. "But maybe it explains it. Maybe it lets you see her as more than the monster you thought she was." Michael nodded against her shoulder. "It doesn't make her a saint, but it makes her human." Months passed, and life slowly softened around the sharp edges Margaret had left behind. Michael no longer carried only bitterness when he thought of her. He carried complexity, a mixture of sorrow and strange compassion. One evening the family gathered again, this time not for mourning but for healing. Michael invited them all to his home, bringing out the notebook Margaret had left behind. Some were hesitant, their wounds still raw. But as he read her words aloud, a hush fell over the room. Tears streamed down cheeks that hadn't cried in years. Some shook their heads, unwilling to forgive. Others closed their eyes, as though hearing the voice of a woman they had never truly known. For the first time, they weren't united by silence or bitterness. They were united by something far more powerful, the recognition that even the hardest hearts can carry hidden love, and that sometimes what people fail to say in life is revealed only after they are gone. Michael closed the notebook, his voice trembling. I think she wanted us to know she wasn't just the hurt she gave us. She was also the hurt she carried." No one spoke right away. But Emily reached for his hand under the table, and Michael felt a peace he hadn't known before. Years later, Michael would still think about that day in the church, when he had stood up and spoken words he wasn't sure he believed. He would think about the silence, the fear, the trembling in his voice. And he would realize that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been speaking only for her. He had been speaking for himself. Because in finding compassion for his grandmother, he had also found compassion for his own wounded heart. And in the end, that was the truest gift she had left him.